tell you what, I'd be absolutely mortified with what I'm going to say now, next, because we're going to have a quiz. I know. And all you got to do is shout out true or false. There is a third option, but we'll come to that in a bit. So, pirates had their own special slang, their own language. True or false? True. It's false. No. And it's absolute twaddle. Because the only thing that Hollywood picked up on was when they recruited Robert Newton to star as Long John Silver in the 1950s film Treasure Island. And he talked like that, really, you know. And the reason he talked like that is because he was from Cornwall. And that's how he spoke in any case. Mind you, in Brixham, where they have a pirate weekend, we went down, and again, I don't want to go on, but we do have a sailing boat in Brixham. And I'm not one to brag, I'm just saying it's only a little one. And this is the reason I do the talks, you see, to keep the sailing going. And they had a pirate weekend, and by God, they were incredible. They were so lifelike, they were all like that, you know, and I thought, oh, that's wrong, because it was only him that spoke like that. Because in fact, real pirates spoke wherever they came from. Some came from London. So, you know, they would have been on the high seas. Here, all right, you watch that sailing, that's somebody's eye out. Some of them were from Bristol, so admittedly, they would have said, you might watch that sailing, that's somebody's eye out. Some of them from Scotland, you know. You'll have somebody's eye out, you know. They spoke like Billy Connolly, you know. Some were French, we'll talk about that. And one pirate was even from the Midlands. You can imagine him in the Caribbean. Oh yeah, what's your jam doing with that sailor? That's somebody's eye out, well yeah. Rhetorical question all good black country people give you. So they spoke wherever they came from. Here's the next question. Pirates flew the Jolly Roger. True or false? Oh, it's true. And it's true because the Jolly Roger is the name that identifies the pirate ship. And it was typically a black flag, not always, but typically, and it could feature a skull and crossbones. It could feature just the bones, it could feature just the skull. Sometimes it just featured a dagger with blood coming from it. And the term Jolly Roger comes from the French Jolet Rouge, which means red flag. And it was used by French privateers in the 17th century. So they would say, the Jolly Rouge, or something like that. It meant put the red flag, which denoted you were a French privateer. So it very quickly became adapted. And it developed into the pirate flag that we know today. What this was actually, folks, was a way of them advertising who they were. It was their form of social media. Because they were particularly vile and horrible to anybody they captured, and they flew their flag. Any ship coming into their view, and they saw a flag of a pirate that they knew was particularly vile, they'd get out the way. It was their form of social media. However, but in reality, each captain flew their own version of the Jolly Roger. Here's a good one. Pirates buried their treasure. True or false?
True.
Well, it ain't, is it? It's false. Because the only way it comes from is some of the Hollywood films that show the pirates burying the treasure. Then what do they go and do in the films? They draw a map. Then what do they go and do? Put a big cross where the treasure is. Well done, lads. You might as well put something on the internet and say, we've just buried treasure here. Here's the cross. It was, what a waste of time. You wouldn't draw a map with a cross on. So it's utter twaddle. What about this one? Pirates walked the plank. True or false? Oh no. And the reason it's false is this because there's virtually no evidence whatsoever of pirates wasting time poking somebody across a scaffolder's plank to chuck them in the sea where the inevitable sharks or whatever was in the sea. No, they just either do them in, beat them up, or chuck them overboard in any case. And then the only way that this has come prevalent with pirates are films like Peter Pan, the early one of 1904 in particular. Here's a good one. Pirates obeyed a pirate code.
True.
I like the cut of your jib, sir, because it is. It's true. And it features the great Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones from the film Pirates of the Caribbean. Now let's face it, Keith Richards didn't even need to go to the makeup van. He just walked straight onto the set, as pickled as he is. Great guitarist though with his Fender Telecaster. However, they did. And we've got some evidence, because this evidence is from a book that was produced in the 18th century, this is contemporary, by a man called Captain Charles Johnson. And he wrote 1 or 2 tomes about pirates. But Captain Charles Johnson may well have been, and there's some evidence to prove, that he may well have been Daniel Defoe. And this is what he wrote up when he discovered and researched, remember this is going back to about 1730, 1740, when he discovered a pirate called Bartholomew Roberts. And this is Bartholomew Roberts' pirate code. Number 1, every man has a vote, even as to who should be captain. Well, that dispelled a lot of myths when I discovered that one. Number 2, if any pirate defrauds the ship's company to the value of $1 in plate or jewellery, marooning was their punishment. More on that in a minute. Number 3, no person was to game at cards or dice for money. Now that swayed a myth that I thought, oh, you can imagine pirates down below doing all this. No, it was banned. And number 4, this is a cracker. The lights and candles were to be put out at 8 o'clock at night. You can imagine, come on now lads, let's have you in bed now, all in bed now. Let's take all the candles out. Can you tuck him in? Yes, oh, thank you very much, sir, thank you very much. But if you wished, and if you were inclined to continue drinking, you could actually get out of your hammock and you could do so on deck in the fresh air. This ain't made up, this is Bartholomew Roberts' code. Number 6, this is pretty obvious, you were to keep your weapons clean and fit for service. This is an interesting one, pirate code number 7. No boy or woman was to be allowed amongst them. And if any man were found seducing any of the latter sex and carried to sea, disguised, he was to suffer death. So you're best off waiting until you got to the nearest island before you started, how can I put it? Shenanigans, oh yes. Shenanigans, blimey, that's 4, well done you, that's a cracker. Number 8, to desert the ship or quarters in battle was punishable by marooning. Again, more on that in a moment. Number 9, no striking one another on board. Instead, you were to go ashore and with pistols drawn, you were to fire a pistol at each other. It always amazes me what a stupid plastic-loaded pistol. However, number 10, no man was to talk of breaking up their way of living until each had shared 1,000 pieces of 8. And I'll come on to pieces of 8 in a minute. And for those pirates who were injured on Bartholomew Roberts' ship, there was a standard compensation code. For example, if you lost an eye, you were given 100 pieces of 8. If you lost a right arm, 600. If you lost a left arm, 500. Assumingly, most pirates therefore were right-handed. A loss of a finger of 100. Now it's almost worth losing your little finger. You know, oh look what I've done, Captain, here, I have 100 pieces of 8. And if you lost that one as well, I mean, you know, these are pretty useless. You could do without them. That's 200 pieces of 8. You could retire for life. If you lost your leg, 400 pieces of 8. Which brings me on to pieces of 8. Now, a piece of 8 was also known as the Spanish dollar. And it was minted from pure silver. And it was so called pieces of 8 because it took 8 reals, and a real was a Spanish currency, to make up 1 Spanish dollar, hence piece of 8. And it was the world's first global currency. Did pirates keep parrots? True or false? True. And it's true because the evidence is clear. It's one of the few animals that could be kept on board a ship as a sort of a pet. And we've got the evidence for that. But what about pirates wearing eye patches and peg legs? True or false? Both. True and false. Because anybody dressing up like me might consider putting on an eye patch or pretend to have a peg leg or a hook for a hand. Well, let's face it, if you lost your leg, you would have a peg leg. Many instances of the Royal Navy of wooden legs being thing. Get Nelson. Oh God, book me talk next year on Lord Nelson, please, because he's my great hero. Losing his right arm, pinned across his chest. However, it's the eye patch that I'm particularly interested in. Because the eye patch was used in pirate times, not because they'd lost an eye. Nelson never wore an eye patch. He never lost his eye. He lost about 78% of the vision in his eye, but he never lost his eye. But the reason they wore eye patches was to protect their night vision in one eye. Now, when one goes sailing at night, if one is stupid enough, where the charts are, you've got a light overhead which is red, and red light preserves your night vision. But pirates had a patch, so when they went up on board at night, they had one eye that was used to the darkness, so it didn't compromise their vision. And did you know that United States Air Force pilots still wear a version of an eye patch today to protect their night vision? Mind you, it might explain friendly fire in Afghanistan, because by some chance they probably had 2 eye patches on now in that lot. However, did they wear earrings? True or false? Oh, it's true. And you know why? Because it wasn't a fashion statement. What the earring did is it put pressure on the earlobe, which warded off seasickness. As simple as that. So yes, they did. What about this one? This is pretty easy. Did pirates maroon troublesome crew members on deserted islands? This is pretty obvious.
Yes.
Oh God, yes.
Yes.
And it was a particularly horrific way to go, because they knew of islands that had no fresh water and no animals, no food, nothing. So what you know in newspapers like The Sun, and they have these cartoons, and they always show a prisoner on a cartoon on a little island with a single palm tree on. Not as bad as that, but that sort of thing. So to be marooned on an island, a tiny island, with nothing, would lead to an agonising death between 3 and 5 weeks. But they would give you a loaded pistol, loaded with 1 ball, with enough powder for 1 shot, so you could actually blow your brains out if you'd had enough after 2 or 3 weeks. Here's a good one. This is pretty obvious again. Did they flog their crew members? True or false? True. Of course, because it was one of the best ways to keep order. The Royal Navy, of course, and European navies used it with great relish. However, what we find is it was seldom used on pirate ships, since those who turned to piracy were pretty desperate characters, and they could easily, remember Bartholomew Roberts' code, vote the captain out. So it was only used very sparingly. This is an absolute beauty. Did the pirates keel haul their crew? Keel hauling, if you don't know,
Yes, true.
most of you probably do. You could be stripped off and then dragged underneath the ship from port, or larboard as it was known then, to starboard. If you were particularly naughty, they'd drag you from the stern to the bow, if you could hold your breath that long. True or false?
True.
Oh yes, it was. But it was rarely used because it was one heck of a deterrent. The Royal Navy used it. And the thing is with keel hauling, is you get these things, barnacles. And as you're dragged underneath, it would shred your skin. And they tended to do it where there would be things like sharks swimming about. And here's a bit of interesting scientific fact about a barnacle. Did you know that when barnacles give birth, that's the right way to describe how barnacles have their young? I have no idea, I'm not a scientist. But when they have baby barnacles, and the baby, crying out loud, it's like being at school, when the baby barnacles go away, they swim off down the river or into the bay. and they can go for hundreds of miles. But when they're mature, do you know that they're able to swim back to exactly the same place where they were born? And that's a fact. And do you know how they do that? It's because, I'm sorry to be a bit Blue Peterish, but Mum and Dad Barnacle stick themselves to ships and rocks by a cement. And that cement has a homing signal in it, if you like. Their own built-in GPS. And they can navigate back to that piece of cement. So, if you're a boat owner, and every winter you have to scrape these damn things off, don't just scrape them off, scrape the cement off as well, because the baby barnacles will be back next year. Isn't that a fascinating fact? If that's not worth the entrance money, I don't know what is. Unbelievable. And your chances of surviving that were less than 50-50. However, what about the black spot? True or false? Possibly. The truth is, we just don't know at all. It may have been. Because it'd be an ideal way to say, you're next, mate. It'd be an ideal way. It only comes from one book, Treasure Island. However, did the pirates punish innocent captives, including torturing their victims?
Yes.
True or false? Well, yeah. And do you know why they did it? It wasn't to be particularly nasty and horrible. Well, it was. But they rarely killed anybody, because what they do, they give you a damn good thumping, or a kicking, or cut a hand off, or whatever they wanted to do, and then let you go. Because what would you do then? You tell everybody, exactly. It was another form of social media. Look what they've done to my hand. Old Edward Teach, you don't get anywhere near him if his ship comes into view. Look at me hand, or rather what's left of it. Oh no. So every time they would see Edward Teach's flag, they'd hide to, or surrender. Because if you surrender to people like Edward Teach, he'd leave you alone. So it was social media at its best. However, particularly vicious characters. So, what if you were caught as a pirate? What punishments could you look forward to if you were caught? Well, the obvious one is flogging. Junior members of pirate crews were genuinely flogged. Remember, it was seldom used on pirate ships. Pirates were sometimes branded with the letter P, sometimes on their foreheads, but more often on their forearms. So you were forever a pirate. In the ultimate, and this was reserved mainly for the captains and the officers on board a pirate ship, you would be hung from the yardarms, and that would take you up to 20 to 30 minutes to actually die. A lot of the junior pirates would receive a pardon, but in times piracy got worse, the authorities got a whole lot tougher. However, if you were unfortunate to be hung, do you mind if I take this off? What do you mean, yes? You wear that for 2 hours. If you were particularly dragged out to be executed, you could be executed, especially in Britain, at your own bona fide, specialised place. This is in Wapping in London. And it was called, and it's called now, Execution Dock. And those flagstones there are the original surface of the Execution Dock. If you take a wider view of it, here it is. And the Prospect of Whitby was a pub then. So the galleries would be full of people watching the latest pirate being hung from this gallows. This is not the original gallows, it's one that was there, it's put there to show where the original was. And of course, this is at low tide. So you'd have a day out. So where you go? Oh, there's executions at Execution Dock. Oh, brilliant, have a day out. And you get vendors selling chicken and souvenirs. And I'll come to a souvenir in a minute. So you sort of gather up there with a pint in your hand, bag of cheese and onion or whatever. And you see a few things going on first, like a branding or a whipping before the main attraction. So there's a whole day out for the family. So that the Alton Towers of the 18th century is this. So it was Execution Dock. And the condemned men stood there and they were permitted to give their last words. Now what happens next is inscrutable people scribes wrote down quickly what they actually said, dashed off and put them into print. And an eager public bought these transcriptions of a pirate's last words. And they were collector's items. So you might have gone to attend an execution, so you could buy one of these from the execution that had happened a few weeks before. And people collected them. This one is the last words and dying confession of a female pirate, Rachel Wall. And I've got a couple of examples. This one is from an anonymous pirate who said this in his transcription. Yes, I do heartily repent. I repent I had not done more mischief, and that we did not cut the throats of them that took us. And I'm extremely sorry that you ain't hanged as well as we. Well, you might as well, haven't you? You're going to be dropped, so you might as well have a go at your captors. And this man, this is Bartholomew Roberts. You remember the code that we went through? This was his transcription before he suffered the hanging. And he said, in honest work, the food is bad. The wages are low and the work is hard. In piracy, however, there is plenty of loot. It's fun and it's easy, and we are free and powerful. Who, when presented with this choice, would not choose piracy? Let's face it, the worst that can happen to ye is you can be hanged. No, a merry life and a short one shall be my motto. So he's got a point. And for particularly notorious pirates, usually the captains, they were hung and then their bodies were left to rot in an iron cage known as a gibbet. And sometimes they were tarred to make the body last longer. And this was a form, again, of social media. It was a warning. If you take up piracy, that's what's going to happen to you if you're not careful. And one example I can give you is the Scottish privateer turned pirate, Captain Kidd, who was found guilty of piracy and murder at his trial in London in 1701. So why did sailors then turn to piracy when they knew, if you're a captain, that is what awaited to you? It's very, very simple, because they didn't have much of a choice. And it stems from the War of the Spanish Succession, fought across Europe for 13 long years from 1701 to 1714, when we once again fought our oldest enemy, France, up and down Europe. Now, the British Navy in 1701 had press-ganged an awful lot of men, thousands of men, to crew the Royal Navy ships. But at the end of the war, 13 years later, they were released. Now, what were they going to do after 13 years serving on the Royal Navy? They could either die poor in the gutters of London, or they could live rich, possibly, as a pirate, even though it would probably be a short life. That's why they turned to piracy. It's one of the reasons. Now, the age of piracy that really was important has been termed by historians as the golden age of piracy. And it goes from about 1650, that's the roundabout Cromwell's time, the year before the Battle of Worcester, up to about 1720. And this is a time that we get the famous pirates plying their trade, where the seafaring lawbreakers saw their height of fame. So piracy is nothing new. I mean, let's face it, it's happening today. And you know, as I say, when you buy a pilot book, but in the back there's also things. If you are going to sail out of British waters, it says in the back, avoid the Straits of Hormuz. Avoid the east coast of Africa, because it's beset with pirates even today, as you're probably aware. However, so during this period of the golden age of piracy, they didn't know it then, but it's called that today, bands of pirates menaced mainly commercial shipping, but very rarely military. Why? Because military shipping was bestowed with guns and cannon. So you avoided it at all costs. Plying their trade in the Caribbean, the North American eastern seaboard, the West African coast, and the Indian Ocean. And it produced many of the famous pirates of all time, including Blackbeard, Calico Jack Brackham, Edward Lowe, and Henry Avery, just to name a few. Characters from the golden age of piracy. Now, they even had their own headquarters, and it was known as Port Royal. and it was in Kingston Harbour in Jamaica. That's more or less where it was. And it was sheltered from the prevailing winds. And this had been a Spanish fort, founded in 1518. So it was a known harbour. And Spain continued to hold this town until we took it off them. Courtesy of Oliver Cromwell. And being a great royalist, book my talk on the English Civil War. And I'll give you my thoughts on the king, God bless him. But Cromwell, I think, raised the Royal Navy to such a state, because before Cromwell it consisted of about half a dozen ships. Cromwell invested heavily in the Royal Navy, and for that we're grateful. And he took this area from the Spanish in 1655. And at one time Port Royal had the reputation of being the wickedest city on earth, even more wickeder than Evesham. To put it into context, that was a joke, by the way, for goodness sake. Now, large number of pirates and ne'er-do-wells would infest this place, and they would come here and they would spend the proceeds and their plunder in the taverns and the brothels and the whorehouses and the places of ill repute, and they were paying extravagant prices for everyday things, because the people who ran these businesses knew when to make a quick buck. And pirates were very strong, fond of strong drink. Well, that goes out saying. But a popular tipple, I learned, was a concoction of rum laced with gunpowder, known as Kill Devil. And it was drunk in tarred leather mugs called blackjacks. Hence the term, you don't want to drink that off, boy, it'll blow your head off. So you can imagine, can't you, having a swig of that and thinking, ooh, I know, I'll have a pipe of tobacco. And virtually all the modern myths of pirate excess comes from what we know about Port Royal. And in 1740, Charles Leslie, another historian at the time, published a book entitled The History of Jamaica. So he travelled to Jamaica and he wrote up what he saw. And that's why this book is so important for us to understand what the pirates were up to. This is what he wrote. And it's wonderful. Wine and women, he writes, drained their wealth to such a degree that in a little time some of them became reduced to beggary. They have been known to spend 2,000 or 3,000 pieces of 8 in one night. And this is the one I really love. And one gave a strumpet. What a great word that is, isn't it? 500 to see her naked. Now, when I get back to see the current Mrs. Keane, I'll try it on your behalf. And I will email your organiser, tell you how I got on. So when I get to the foot of our stairs, I'll say, I'll dress up, I don't mind. Oh, strumpet, I should give you 50 pence to see you. Oh, dear. Yes, dear, I'll put the washing out straight away, dear. So I'll let you know how I get on, but I wouldn't bank on it. I think it's the strumpet word that we do it for them. It's a strumpet, I love it. And he goes on. They used to buy a pipe of wine, place it in the street, and oblige everyone that passed it to drink from it. And if you didn't, they'd blow your head off. Now, that ain't made up. That was from a man who researched it because he went in 1740. Or he wasn't then 1740, but he'd researched, he'd been there before, and he'd spoken to people. However, the town of Port Royal was destroyed by a terrible earthquake shortly after. Now, eyewitness accounts tell of houses being swallowed up by the earth. And we now know that it's a process known as liquefaction. That's when the lava underneath rises up to such a degree that it becomes liquid and the houses just sink into it. It's something to do with volcanology. I've not got a clue, really. I'm just saying what I read from Google. But this is Port Royal in 1690, and that was what it was like come 1840. So most of Port Royal now exists under the water. So if you want to get some scuba diving, in fact you don't need scuba because it's quite shallow, and you can go and swim around Port Royal as much as you like. So now we're going to look at some of the most famous pirates that terrorised the Caribbean before we have a short break. And I'll tell you the ones we're going to look at, and then we'll have a break. So some of the most famous pirates that terrorised the Caribbean and the Spanish Main. So in the Caribbean and beyond, they will live in history upon the waves of bravado, whether for renown, misplaced fame, or pure cruelty. But they all enjoyed a specific period within the golden age of piracy, and they were usually short-lived. And these are the most notorious. William Kidd, Scottish, died in 1701. Edward Teach, the famous Blackbeard. English, died in 1718. Bartholomew Roberts, Black Bart, died in 1722. Henry Every, known as Long Ben, English. We don't know when he died, but we know he was born in 1653. Anne Bonny, by God, she was a wildcat. She was Irish, and more on her later. She died in 1782. Sir Henry Morgan, he was Welsh, wasn't he? And he died in 1688. This cracks me up. Edward England, who was Irish, died in 1721. And Calico Jack, also known as John Rackham, died in 1720. And the last one, Samuel Bellaby, known as Black Sam. Don't know when he died, but he was born in 1689. And at that point, before we look into the careers of some of these pirates, we're going to have a little break. And with that, let's have a little break. Shouldn't I have come back specially? I know, don't start, because you've all had a glass of wine, I know. Now then, here's a good one. If you don't know what to do, on the first weekend in August, go to the Battle of Evesham reenactment. It is going to be spectacular. Mick's the organiser with... yeah. And if you want to know any more, go and see Mick. And I'm doing a talk on Edward I in Mail and stuff. And the person following me is Tony Robinson. You know, no pressure there, is there? Thank you, Nick. No pressure at all. So, and it's going to be the reenactment. What year is it? The what's what?
760th.
760th, the Battle of Evesham. And I have to say, one of the bloodiest battles in English history. So, if you've nothing to do, I'll see you there. Especially if you come to me talk on Edward I. Now, oh yes. So we're going to look first of all at one or two pirates. First one being William Kidd, babyface. He was Scots. He was a 17th century privateer, and he was a semi-legendary pirate who became celebrated in English literature as perhaps one of the most colourful outlaws of all time. And fortune seekers have hunted his buried treasure. And I've said to you, what did I say to you about false? Well, it's not strictly buried. And you'll see what I mean in a mo. Now, not much is known about Kidd's early career, but we do know by 1690 he was an established sea captain and a ship owner in New York City, where he owned property. And at various times he was dispatched by both the New York and the Massachusetts governors to rid the coast of enemy privateers, notably the French and Spanish. Good. The ladies of Solihull WI did not vociferously boo and hiss with that one. Quite frightening. Now in London in 1695 he actually received a royal commission to apprehend pirates who were molesting the ships of the great trading company, the East India Company, which of course would lead to the Raj in India, in the Red Sea and in the Indian Ocean. Now he went off and he avoided the normal pirate hordes by arriving at the Comoros Islands, in particular an island called Moroni. And it was apparent, not bad if you can get it. What a lovely view from your office window. And apparently, sometime after his arrival, Kidd, still without having taken a single pirate ship, decides at that seminal point to, why don't I have a go at piracy? Because it seems to me it's very difficult to actually catch one. So he did. And he took his most valuable prize. This was an Armenian ship, the Quedagh merchant ship, in January 1698. And he scuttled his own unseaworthy ship, the Adventure Galley. And when he reached Anguilla in the West Indies in 1699, he learned that he'd been denounced by the government as a pirate. So what does he do? He leaves this ship off the island of Hispaniola, where he scuttled her with its treasure on board. That's why I said he didn't, strictly speaking, bury it, but he scuttled her, so he knew where it was. No map, no cross, nothing. And he sailed in a newly purchased ship called the Antonio, where he makes his way to New York City, where he tries to persuade the Earl of Bellamont, the colonial governor of New York, of his innocence. "You want me, Gov? They made me do it," kind of thing. However, Bellamont sent him to England for trial, and he was found guilty in 1701 on 5 indictments of piracy, even though he produced a letter in the trial giving him permission from the British to attack French ships. Now, important evidence concerning the piracy case was actually suppressed at the trial, and some observers later questioned whether the evidence was actually sufficient for a guilty verdict. What this actually was, folks, was a show trial. What they were doing is showing, yes, he was sanctioned by the British government, but he turned to piracy. Now look what's going to happen to him if you decide to be a pirate. And so he spent his last days on earth here at Newgate Jail, where on Sunday the 18th he heard his final sermon by the prison chaplain on the cheerful text, "For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ." I mean, blimey, that must have really cheered him up. I mean, why not give him a DVD of Peter Kay on tour? That would have been far better. However, he still hoped for a reprieve. He still didn't believe at that point they were actually going to hang him. But he was taken in a horse-drawn cart, along with some French prisoners as well, to execution dock. And when he arrived, the prison chaplain was shocked, because Kidd was the worst for drink. And at 5 o'clock at low tide, they reached execution dock in Wapping, in the presence of a large and lively crowd, as you can imagine. There were permanent gallows for the pirates, as we've already said, and these timbers here were used to chain the corpse to till 2 tides had flown over them, or washed over them. And that was to make sure that they were actually dead. Because let's face it, if you can hold your breath for about 8 hours till the tide's above you, then well done you, is all I can say. However, Kidd was hanged, but the rope snapped and he fell to the boards. Now, strictly speaking, I always thought that was an act of God and they would let him go. But oh no, this is a show trial. This man is going to hang. So they found some more rope and strung him up again. And this time he was dead. And it was a warning to other would-be pirates. This is what's going to happen to you. And some of his treasure was actually recovered. And at the time as well. And proceeds were taken and donated to charity. And Captain Kidd has become inseparable from the romanticised concept of the swashbuckling pirates of Western fiction. He was nothing of the sort, of course. Now we come on to this chap, Blackbeard. Now then, you're going to be amazed with this chap, because he's synonymous, isn't he, with pirating. And so many pirates in so many films, including that dreadful series Pirates of the Caribbean, which I actually love, because it's good fun. But one or two are based on this chap. His name was Edward Teach, or possibly Thatch, and he served England as a privateer. Now, a privateer is a sort of a pirate, but he only attacks the ships of his country's enemy. And I'll give you another example of a privateer, Sir Francis Drake, one of my great heroes. And do you know the people of Plymouth wanted to pull his statue down? Do you know why? Because of his links with slavery. Now then, if they bother to read their history, they will know that Drake befriended some escaped black slaves called the Cimarroons. And in particular, one black slave was a man called Diego. It wasn't his name, it's what the Spanish had given him. And Diego attached himself to Francis, and he became his manservant. Not because he had to, because he wanted to. And he sailed around the world with Drake, probably becoming the first black circumnavigator in Europe, I don't know. But he served Drake faithfully. So that nullifies anything that people say, we should tear that statue down. So what are we going to do? Tear every statue down? Bring up the carpet and sweep our history under the carpet? And then look at our history through 21st century eyes? Well, really? Could you possibly understand how this chap felt 300 or 400 years ago? I couldn't possibly, and look at it the other way around. If we could resurrect him, what would he make of today's world? Looking at it through 18th century eyes. That's what gets me about modern historians, trying to put 21st century sensibilities on our history. That's my rant over. However, but we know, no, please, no, that wasn't an indictment to clap. Just give me money. I'm far happy. But he was from Bristol, so he probably told like that, didn't he? Now we know that Bristol at the time was the Heathrow airport of its day, because ships were coming from the New World, from Africa, from India and from Asia. It really was the trading hub of England. Now, we can't be certain about his education, but we do know that he was born in a relatively wealthy family, and he could also speak and write in Latin. So he was much more intelligent than your average pirate. And, surprisingly, he preferred to avoid fighting whenever he could. He didn't actually like it. Wouldn't surprise me if he said, oh, don't do that, I don't like the bangs, oh no. So he wasn't perhaps the vicious person. I mean, it could be, but in general not. So let's discover why. Well, he wore his hair long, for a start off. He had a long black beard, surprisingly. He was tall and broad-shouldered. And during battle, as you're probably well aware, he put lengths of slow-burning fuse in his beard and hair, and it would splutter and smoke, giving him an altogether demonic look. This cord is like it's cord weighing that's soaked in saltpetre, the same stuff that you fire a matchlock musket with. So if you light it, it sort of fizzes with the saltpetre. Imagine him coming at you down a dark alley. However, some said he was mad, and he probably was, because we think, in fact we know, he suffered from syphilis. Well, there's a surprise, because most pirates did after visiting Port Royal. And although they believed that mercury was the cure, mercury also sends you round the bend. However, and victims of the pox eventually went mad. Might explain this. But he also dressed the part. He wore a fur cap or a wide hat, high leather boots and a long black coat. And he also wore a modified pistol sling where he had 6 pistols ready to be used. And soon Blackbeard had an air of supernatural terror about him. And he and his men sailed the Caribbean and the Atlantic coast of North America, torturing merchant ship crews. Why? Remember, social media to advertise him. And stealing cargo and gaining a reputation as perhaps one of the most notorious pirates in history. But despite his outlandish persona and his reputation, his time was really short-lived. Because how did he cultivate this? Because he used fear and intimidation to cause his enemies to surrender without a fight. So by looking like that and cultivating this image and sending his social media viral by sending his tortured victims out to spread the word, it quickly became clear that you needed to avoid this man at all costs. And it was in his best interest. And the victimised ships could actually be utilised, and valuable plunder was not lost, and useful men on board the ships could be recruited as carpenters or doctors or made to join the pirate crew. And generally, if any ship encountered Blackbeard, as long as they surrendered peacefully, Blackbeard would loot it and let it go on its way, or put some men aboard some other ship if he decided to sink it as a victim. But there were exceptions. English merchant ships were sometimes treated harshly, as was any ship from Boston, where he learned that some pirates had recently been hung. Now, piracy became rampant in North Carolina after Blackbeard bribed the colonial governor, Charles Eden, to ignore what he was up to. But even him, after tolerating Blackbeard's terrorism for 18 months, he and the North Carolina residents and merchant sailors begged Virginia's colonial governor, Alexander Spotswood, for help. What a great name that is, folks. Alexander Spotswood. Now, when I was a Year 6 teacher for 39 years, because I can't stand the little ones, you'd never find me in Year 1, because he used to pull your trousers when you used to go in. I'd say, get off. And then, Martin, he's been mean to me. I'd say, oh, great. Couldn't stand it. But Year 6, I can handle it. And I used to line them up, and I used to say, it's nothing to do with pirates, just a nice teaching story, I suppose. Oh, any Ofsted inspectors in? Any ex-Ofsted inspectors in? Oh, good, delete that one from the video. And I used to, because my reputation was a bit like Blackbeard, you see, after 39 years, because I was teaching kids of kids that I taught. So I used to come in, and some of the bottom lips would be doing this. I said, what's the matter with you? I said, are you cold? No, I'm frightened. Are you? Come and stand here, come on. I said, you heard all these nasty stories about me. The way I shout. I said, don't worry, because they're all true. And you've got 9 months of me. And by the end in July, they're all crying because they don't want to leave. And I used to say to them, right, you lot, line up. I know, right. I shall forget your name, but what's your name? What's your name? John. What's your name? Ian. What's your name? Wayne. This isn't a black country. What's your name? Cheyenne. Cheyenne. And I always wrote this, what's your name? Dirk. I said, Dirk? I said, what they call you Dirk for? Hang on, what's your name? Alexander Spotswood, sir. Flipping heck. House point dude. That is brilliant. I'd give him a house point if the name was brilliant. Anyway, moving on. I have some more stories from teaching, which I probably won't reveal. However, so, Alexander Spotswood arranges an ambush of Blackbeard's ships, and he offers a bonus for Blackbeard's death. Now, the Royal Navy Lieutenant Robert Maynard is the commanding officer of the arranged assault, in charge of 2 ships, and they find Blackbeard here on the Ocracoke Inlet on November the 22nd, 1718. So Blackbeard is here, and the 2 Royal Navy ships are over here. Maynard's 2 ships were HMS Jane and HMS Ranger, and they were immediately fired upon by Blackbeard's ship as they closed in the Adventure. And when Jane began to take a lot of damage, Maynard ordered the crew to go below deck, creating the illusion of an abandoned vessel. Blackbeard took the bait. Leading a charge aboard the vessel, he and his men were heartily surprised by Maynard's crew as they leapt up from the hold and with a volley of musket fire put paid to Blackbeard and his crew. Blackbeard himself, we are told by Maynard's log, suffered 25 stab wounds and 5 gunshots before succumbing to his injuries. They decapitated him and they hung his head off the bowsprit of HMS Ranger. His body was tossed overboard, bringing a literal end to Blackbeard and a symbolic end to Atlantic coast piracy. Now, his legacy is the fact that Blackbeard was very good at being a pirate captain because he had the right mix of ruthlessness, cleverness and charisma to enable a massive treasure fleet. And he used it to his best advantage. And Blackbeard's cultural impact throughout the centuries is tremendous because he stands, doesn't he, as the quintessential pirate, the fearsome, cruel spectre of nightmares. He's been the subject of several movies for a start off, and there's even a museum devoted to him and other pirates in North Carolina. And the wreck of his ship, the Queen Anne's Revenge, was discovered. in 1996. This is a 3D scan of her. I mean, she's in worse condition than this 3D scan shows, but she's fairly complete. And it's turned out to be a treasure trove of information, as you can probably gather. Did you know, when I was watching Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, with Chris, what's his name? Him. And I didn't know any of I knew up to about £1,000. For all the questions up to the millionaire question, I didn't know. Till it got to the millionaire question, I swear to you. The millionaire question was, Chris Tarrant says, what was the name of Blackbeard's ship? And I shouted at the telly, Queen Anne's Revenge! Queen Anne's Revenge! And up it popped, £1,000,000. Fantastic. Isn't that amazing? Yeah. I thought so as well. And there's a band in Brixham. If you go to Brixham,
yep.
Give me a wave. I'm the one with the mast sticking out the water because it's probably sunk. But there's a band called Queen Anne's Revenge. There's only 2 of them, but they play some great stuff, guitar and fiddle. Keep an eye out on Queen Anne's Revenge. However, on to our next one, because this man is Bartholomew Roberts, and he's been described as probably the most successful pirate of them all. And he was Welsh. And did you know, by the way, that it was the Welsh on board Sir Francis Drake's ship, the Golden Hind, that named some white-headed birds that couldn't fly as they rounded Cape Horn, and they named them Tosta Morda Dosha Gugogorcha da Penguina. And it means, penguin means, I don't know what the rest of it meant, so I made that up, but penguin means white-headed bird. Again, I don't know how much paid for tonight, but that alone is worth it. Because you might be mightn't you, in some kind of pub quiz, and the question is, where did the penguin get its name? There you go, I've just told you. Sir Francis Drake's Welsh crew. However, during his brief but spectacular career, he captured over 200 ships, more than all his contemporaries combined. But his reign of terror eventually ended on the West African coast in 1722, when he was killed in a sea battle with the British warship. The date was the 10th of February. And the pirate captain had put on his finest clothes for the battle. He knew damn well he was going to die. You can't take on a Royal Navy ship mounting at least 80 guns and expect to survive it. And so he dressed in, so we know from accounts that people knew who he was because that's how he dressed. A rich crimson suit, a hat with a red feather in it, and a priceless gold cross and chain. And so everyone who saw him knew what had happened. Now we don't know exactly how he died, but die he did. And with his death, the fight went out of the remaining crew. But the Royal Navy ship HMS Swallow continued to fire until the battered pirate ship surrendered. Roberts was no more, and his death effectively marked the end of the golden age of piracy. And to make their point, the British now held a mass pirate trial on Cape Coast Castle. Roberts' 77 African crewmen were sold as slaves. Now, I'll come on to the thorny subject of slaves and slavery towards the end of the tour. But the 77 African slaves that Roberts had captured, or rather released from a slaving ship, they were put back into slaves. Their European shipmates were either hung or condemned to servitude in the nearby gold mines or shipped back to prison in London. A few were acquitted, having proved that they'd served Roberts against their will. However, 52 of Roberts' crew were hung together, and that mass hanging served its purpose, because it demonstrated to the world that piracy didn't pay, but the image of this Welsh-born pirate has endured down the centuries. Now, in the interest of equality, we got this wildcat. This is Anne Bonny. Remember I told you about her? Irish. Now, she's remembered probably as one of the most famous female pirates who operated at this time. Now, according to Captain Charles Johnson's book, Anne Bonny was born around 1700 in Cork in Ireland as a result of a scandalous affair between her father and his maid. Yes, just like my great-great-great-grandfather. Oh, I bet you want to hear about this one. Because my great-great-great-grandfather was none other than Lord Francis de Witt from Lower Slaughter near Bolton-on-the-Water. And the manor house in which he lived is now the hotel.
Beautiful.
It is. So half of me is nobility. And I've always known it. Always known it. I used to come in year 6. Hello, Mr. Keane. No, sir. Or your grace. Either will do, but sir or your grace. Or my lord is even better. Why? And I'll tell them about my history. Seems that Lord Francis de Witt hopped into bed with a certain Anne Elizabeth Keane, the serving wench. And she lived in a little cottage which is still there. Now, in the great scandal, a child was born. And with the great scandal, they shipped her off to Stourbridge. This is where the Keanes come. If you go to Lower Slaughter, you'll see the grave of my great-great-great-grandmother. They shipped her back from Stourbridge, and Mary Ann Elizabeth Keane. There it is. So you see, I know it's posh around here, but I'm a block deal posher than you. Well, half of me is, I suppose. Isn't that a great story? I thought so. Lord Francis de Witt. So it's a bit the same here. So, for a while, in order to cover up his affair, his father dressed her as a boy and passed her off as a legal clerk. And in fear of his reputation, her father eventually moved the entire family to America to seek a better life. So from birth, she's tainted as an outsider. And people look down on her. But she was a young girl, and she loved adventure. And she moved from place to place in America, and man to man as well. And she had a reputation of being a right hellcat. And during her few short years as a shipmate and lover of the pirate captain Calico Jack Rackham, she proved herself to be an equal to any other pirate. She could drink, she could work, she could fight alongside any of them. And she knew people like Blackbeard and Edward Law and Bartholomew Roberts. And much of the information that we know about her comes from this book, Captain Charles Johnson's book, called A General History of the Pirates, which was released in 1724, only a few years after the end of Anne's pirate career. So this is contemporary. So in her early years, we learn that Anne proved to be rather difficult. Well, you know, there's a surprise. However, she despised the normal life. So seeking adventure, she quickly falls in love with a small-time criminal and pirate by the name of James Bonny, who hoped to grab some of the lucrative business and the wealth that Anne was entitled to after her wedding. But her father is having none of it. He didn't approve of her relationship with this low-born criminal, so he totally disowned his daughter. Now, there are no historical proofs, but it's a rather interesting thing that Anne's father's sugar plantation mysteriously burned to the ground shortly after he cast her out of his will. So, freed from her family and all legal ties, Anne and James Bonny eventually ended up in one of the most famous pirate gathering points, New Providence Island in the Bahamas, sometime between 1714 and 1718. And there Anne quickly became friends with the pirates that visited the port, including Blackbeard. But James didn't follow her. He didn't wish to join them. He's quite happy as a career criminal. And his decision created animosity between the couple. So she decides to leave her husband and marry Orlando Bloom, according to the Pirates of the Caribbean. In fact, Orlando Bloom here is playing the part of Rackham, John Rackham. Now, John Rackham was a fully fledged pirate. He was Premier League quality. And Rackham actually bought Anne from James Bonny because divorce was very expensive and generally only for the wealthy. And what a great idea that is. So, again, when I go home, I'll attempt to offload Mrs. Keane. I'll report back to the organisers and tell you how I get on. You can probably visit me in Kidderminster Hospital, I would imagine. So, to deceive the rest of the crew on board Rackham's pirate ship, the Revenge, and here she is, Anne wore yet again a male disguise, and she worked as a regular member of the crew. Now, Rackham successfully captured fishing and trading vessels in the Caribbean, and the English government began to take notice of his rise in popularity. And not wanting him to become too powerful, the English authorities sent the most famous pirate hunter, Jonathan Barnett, to find Rackham and apprehend him. Jonathan Barnett, the equivalent I can think of is Van Helsing, tracking down Dracula. That's about the same kind of thing that Jonathan Barnett was. And he managed to find him in October 1720, when Rackham and his crew were celebrating their latest pirating plunder while being anchored in Dry Harbour Bay in Jamaica. And under cover of dawn, forces of Jonathan Barnett boarded the Revenge, where they found the crew completely out of their heads and drunk after the previous day's celebration. And in the fight that ensued, it was said that only Anne Bonny represented the only major force of resistance to the invaders. The majority of the crew, we are told, hid under the deck in absolute fear. But after a short struggle, every member of Rackham's crew was chained and transported to Spanish Town, where they were convicted and executed. And as a proof of John Rackham's cowardice, during their capture, Anne Bonny famously said at her trial, if he had fought like a man, he need not have been hanged like a dog. And as a warning to the would-be pirates, the body of the hanged Rackham was tarred and placed near the entrance of Port Royal's harbour. If you want to know what Port Royal was, wonderful lady here scuba dived on it. The remains of Port Royal, haven't you? So if you want to know what it's like, don't ask me. Ask our friend over there. However, the exact fate surrounding Anne Bonny is a little less clear, because we don't know. However, the latest research from the latest historians claim to have found evidence that Anne managed to leave the prison, most probably after the intervention of her father, who paid her out. And after that, we know from this latest evidence that she had several children, including John Rackham's child that she was with. Then she moved to Charlestown in South Carolina, where she had 10 more children with her new husband Joseph Burley before she died at the age of 80 in 1782. I mean, what a life that is. I mean, by God, she sailed close to the wind. But after all that, to have 11 kids and die at the age of 80, I should imagine she was pretty well worn out. As we're coming towards the end, and I'm desperate to get back to the King's Arms at Stourport for the last one, this already baby face, genuine baby face. This is Sir Henry Morgan, the Buccaneer King. Now, despite some of his actions being brutal and illegal, Henry Morgan wasn't, strictly speaking, a pirate, because he was a privateer. He's described as a remarkable leader, a fearsome conqueror, and by God, he had 9 lives, as we shall learn. He was born in Wales, and he decided to move on because he had a dream to be a sailor. And although Morgan wanted to gain wealth and fame as soon as possible, a pirate way of life wasn't in his interest, basically because he wanted a longer life. So he therefore joined England's naval army to serve as a buccaneer. And we're talking now about Cromwell's naval army. And they were based in Fort Royal, and they fought the Spanish. Now, it's uncertain, we don't know when, Morgan arrived in Jamaica, but it must have happened sometime in 1655 during Oliver Cromwell's protectorate, when the island was occupied by Cromwell's naval army, the English buccaneers. He then joins the Cromwellian English forces, the New Model Army, which attacked and robbed Spanish colonies in the Caribbean. And there he built his career, first as a common soldier, and then as a respected sailor. And finally in 1662 he became captain of a small privateering vessel of his own. And he loved the finer things in life. He loved the best wine and delicious foods and elegant clothes. And he saw piracy, or buccaneering, as the quickest way of winning these things for himself. But he was clever enough to cover his back by making a career in legitimate thieving. Now in 1667, we note that Britain and Spain signed a treaty in which they promised not to attack each other's ships. Now that was about as useless as the treaty that's gone on between Iran and Israel at the moment. It's about as watertight as that one. Let's hope it holds out, having said that. But the treaty quickly broke down, and months later the Spanish were preparing to attack Jamaica from their base in Cuba and take back what they thought was theirs. Now the governor of Jamaica, Sir Thomas Modiford, knew his defences were inadequate. So he called up a mercenary force of local pirates, buccaneers and privateers, and this was Henry Morgan's moment, and he grasped it. Because from now on, he could attack the Spanish at will, or with the permission of the English government. And at first he limited himself to the taking of ships, but he soon concluded there was far more wealth to plunder if he went ashore. And his exploits became even more wild and adventurous when Morgan and his man attacked Maracaibo, modern-day Venezuela. And after a rather easy fight and looting of the town of Maracaibo, they found their escape to sea blocked by 3 Spanish ships of the line. So you're talking 80 guns, maybe 100 on each ship. So what does Morgan do faced with that? Well, he offers to return all that he'd nicked if the Spanish ships would let him out so he could pass safely out to sea. They ain't going to do that, are they? And the Spanish admiral laughingly laughed at him. And things looked favourable for the capture of Morgan, because he was sailing with 2 small schooners straight towards the 3 Spanish warships. And the first of Morgan's schooners seemed to be especially seeking disaster, because in spite of continued cannon bombardment, she kept a straight course until she was alongside the first Spanish warship. Then all became clear, because a half a dozen pirates leapt from the ship and she burst into flames. She was a fire ship. She was probably prepared with oil, soaking her from stem to stern, with resin and pitch soaking her decks. Flames leapt, gunpowder exploded, and embers rained down on the sails and the rigging of the Spanish warship, and both ships sank together. And the second man of war skedaddled out of the harbour as fast as it could. And the third Spanish ship, Morgan took for himself. I mean, what a feat that is. And it should go down in the annals of naval history, because that's one hell of an escapade. So now we see Morgan having time to relax, and we find him in 1669, get this, having a pig roast on the deck of HMS Oxford off the coast of Haiti. Now I don't know about you, but barbecues and wooden ships is probably not a good idea. And we know he took his beef burger or whatever he had cooked on the barbecue, and he took it down below deck in his luxurious cabin, when a spark from the barbecue, what a surprise, ignited the gunpowder magazine and blew away the entire bow of the ship. And by some miracle, Morgan survived when he was thrown through an open gun port and picked up by a friendly ship. Now, yet the chances of being fired out of a ship in a gun port about that size is pretty unlikely. But he did, and it's a good job the thing was open as well. Otherwise, he would have been splattered. However, the government in Britain is actually uneasy about the overly successful Henry Morgan. Why? Because the country was on the brink of war with the Dutch. Why? Because the Dutch would not recognise the Commonwealth of Britain under Cromwell. In fact, neither did any European country. So the Dutch decided to have a go at us over trade. However, he wanted to make sure, the British government, that Spain would remain neutral, and he couldn't afford to have Morgan attacking Spanish ships. And in London, the Spanish ambassador furiously complained about the destruction Morgan had written on various towns in South America, including Panama, the major Spanish trading post. So Morgan was summoned home to England to answer for crimes against His Majesty. God save your Majesty. Charles, one of the greatest kings of England. Now you can sit there till you're blue in the face and tell me that he wasn't, but I'm saying to you that he was. Why? Because he was one of the few English kings, him, Edward II, as unlikely as that might seem, who enjoyed the common man and the thatcher and the ditch digger more than his court. And the other king was Richard III. God bless him. Please put my talk on Richard III, because I'll give you the truth. I'll give you the truth about Richard III. Any Tudor apologists amongst us? But he understood, Majesty, pardon me back. He understood the common man and common woman. Because let's face it, it was the common man and the common woman who hid him after the Battle of Worcester on the 3rd of September 1651. The famous Royal Oak at Boscobel, Your Majesty. And the common man or woman, had they been found sheltering the king, of course, would have been put to death. And he understood them. And that's why he remains to me one of the greatest kings. I know he was a bit of a lad. But so would I be if I was King of England. He was responsible for saving most of London from the fire of London, Majesty. However, the king kept him in London for 3 years whilst Morgan awaited the verdict of the king. But he was never actually arrested. In fact, he was treated like a national hero, and he was fiercely defended by many, claiming that Jamaica would be in the hands of the Spanish if it not for Henry Morgan. As a result, Morgan is knighted, and he returns to the Caribbean, to Jamaica, where he is given the post of deputy governor. He was now Sir Henry Morgan, gentleman, patriotic hero, and became the owner of a prosperous sugar plantation. But he couldn't completely shake off his desire for a more adventurous life. So he takes up the command of a new ship in 1675 called the Jamaica Merchant. And he takes his ship back to the shores of Haiti to salvage some of the looted Spanish treasure he had hidden on the Oxford. But the seas were too powerful. And guess what happened? The ship went down in a hurricane. And Morgan survived. And after this scare for the umpteenth time, he hung up his sword for good and never again led any privateering raids. In total, Morgan cleared some 4 million pieces of 8. Now imagine how much that's worth today. 4 million solid silver Spanish dollars, known as pieces of 8. I shudder to think how much it's worth today. However, he died from alcohol poisoning on August the 25th, 1688, at the age of 53 in Lawrenceville, Jamaica. And isn't it unbelievably ironic that if you go to Tesco's or something like that, you'll be able to purchase a bottle of Captain Morgan rum? We're coming to the end because I've had enough now. And this is one of the last ones. This is Sam Bellamy, so called because he had black hair. This man fought smart, he harmed few, and he scored big. He became a ship's boy at the age of 13, and by the end of the War of the Spanish Succession, he'd become a skilled sailor. And it seems that Bellamy settled in Cape Cod in Massachusetts. Now, as a pirate captain, Bellamy cut a dashing figure. He wore a long velvet coat, knee breeches, silk stockings, and buckled shoes. Well, try walking down Stourport High Street looking like that, young man. And famously, Bellamy never wore a powdered wig. Instead, he wore his long black hair tied back into a ponytail with a satin bow. But he was everything. He was democratic. He treated everyone under his command equally, including a third of his crew, who were black and formerly enslaved. And in return, Bellamy's crew were loyal to him. They called him the Robin Hood of the seas because he stole from the rich and shared plundered treasure with his shipmates. Indeed, Bellamy himself saw himself as a Robin Hood figure. This is what he said:
They vilify us, the scoundrels do. He once declared, when there is only this difference, they robs the poor under the cover of law. Bracket Rachel Reeves, close bracket. Oh, big political, Maxwell, big political there. I'm only joking. They robs the poor under the cover of law, forsooth, and we plunders the rich under the protection of our own courage. By all accounts, Black Sam was an excellent tactician and daring. His reputation spread like wildfire throughout the Caribbean and became one of the most notorious pirates. But he was renowned by being very fair in the way he dealt with ships he captured. He always gave captured captains the opportunity to join his crew, the opportunity, as he saw it, to show off their shackles of oppression. And his most treasured ship was this one. It was the Widal. Now the Widal was a slaving ship. Now let me explain this. Because by this time the English merchants, this is where we're going to slaving, especially the slave traders, were becoming thoroughly sick of losing their profits to pirates. Remember, pirates were taken and they were using the crew, the escaped, the captured black slaves, and they joined their crews. Now, the Widar galley was christened after the West African slave trading kingdom of Widar. She was heavily armed and heavily as a transport ship as well. She was fitted with 18 6-pounder guns, which could be increased to 28. Now the Widar sold its human cargo in Jamaica, and as a result, she started on her journey back, reportedly holding more than 4.5 tons of gold and silver from selling the slaves. But the treasure would be the Widar's undoing, because he, Bellamy, captured this ship with the money on it, and he decided to return her to Cape Cod. And he allegedly told his crew, lads, we've gotten enough, it's time to go home. But his luck had run out, because as Bellamy and his pirates returned home, a terrible storm whipped off the coast of Massachusetts, and in 1717 the Widar plunged into the sea, and all but 2 men perished in the wreck. And in 1984, the wreck of the Widar was found off the coast of Massachusetts. And since then, divers have recovered over 200,000 artifacts, including cannons, including thousands of coins, 400 pieces of jewellery and more. And most importantly, the ship's bell that clearly has the name of the ship on it. But they're hoping to find something more valuable. They were hoping to find Samuel Bellamy's remains, because in February 2021, divers found a preserved shoe, and it matches exactly the description of one of Bellamy's shoes. And in the shoe was part of the femur bone. Is that the femur bone of Samuel Bellamy, the Robin Hood of the seas? I don't know, but it might be. It was in the shoe. However, having listened patiently to all the twaddle that I've given you, and I hope we've taken out the fiction from the fact, or the fact from the fiction, and we'll agree that few are actually beloved, I suppose, and country beloved as pirates. I mean, how many times, if there's a dressing up game at school, they end up as pirates with hooks and everything else like that. They were beholden to nobody, neither king nor crown nor the law. Their lives were short and brutal, but eternal fame and unmatchable wealth awaited them. And much of what we've all come to love about pirates can be exemplified in Port Royal in Jamaica. And even Nassau in the Bahamas was a kind of pirate republic, filled today, of course, with cruise ships and Americans. And the port city of Nassau was built by pirates and by pirate money. But after the 30 Years' War in 1648, we start to see a rise in piracy and then a drop. Why? Because the European powers, in particular France, Spain, Portugal, Holland, or the Dutch, and England, were increasing their royal navies. Why? Because of the effects of the loss of profits of the slave trade. So it was that that ultimately led to the navies increasing to protect the profits of the slave trade. They were given specific... Oh, and people like this nitwit were hung en masse, as we've discovered. And do you know, old Jack Sparrow, whatever his name is, what's the actor's name? Johnny Depp. I was in Norwich, there is a link, with the current Mrs. Keane. And we went into an art gallery to see some Billy Connolly art. It was very good, you know. But in the corner was an art exhibition by him. And it looked to me like a 7-year-old had done it with his feet. £32,000 a pop. I thought, Johnny, you're having a laugh, dude. No talent whatsoever. You can't act, let's face it. You certainly can't, pardon?
Good guitar player.
Well, you might say so's John Lennon, far better. Yeah, well, he can play a bit, I'll grant you that one. Where was I? See, you've knocked me off now. Well, he can't draw. He can play guitar, but that's the only thing he can do. However, these British ships were given specific missions to hunt down the remaining pirates. And as we know, those that were captured were put on trial. And the British government set up new commissioners, 7 new ones, whose sole purpose was to get as many pirates through the legal system as they possibly could. It ended up with 10% of the pirates of the Caribbean, or around 600, being put on trial and executed. But as I've said, ultimately it was the threat to the slave trade that meant the ending of piracy. But it caused the pirates to react in kind. They often, as they knew their time was ending, they would burn merchant ships, they blockaded towns, and we've even got examples of blowing themselves up rather than be taken. But their fate was already spelled out for the few remaining pirates who either gave up or died fighting. And on that bombshell Harvington Festival, I've had it. Thank you very much, folks. Very kind.